Hello, buonasera a tutti. This is Michael Severance from Istituto Acton, Acton's Rome office. And I'm here today under some difficult and challenging conditions during the national quarantine in Italy. And I, like 2.5 million other Romans, were under strict lockdown to simply stay at home, do some necessary shopping, educate our children at home as well. And basically, we're waiting this period out to see if the contagion will significantly be reduced, and so we can conduct our normal lives. But until then, God asks us to make use of our creativity, intelligence, to carry on working and doing His will. And so with a little adaptation, we normally do this podcast in person. I've made use of my cell phone, my headset, and video cameras and internet, and I invited a very special guest, Father Bob Gahl from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross, to join us and to enlighten us on an issue called focus that will help us rise above our fears and carry on and find solutions.
Hi Michael, it's Father Bob Gahl here from the other side of Rome. You down in a suburb to the south of Rome, myself just to the north of the center of the city. Thanks so much for coming up with this idea of having this podcast in this especially trying time, this time of crisis having to do with coronavirus, in which Italy has been especially hard hit. And the ICU units throughout the country, but especially in the north, are really overwhelmed right now by a surge of cases. And unfortunately, we should probably expect that Italy will be a kind of a sign for what may be coming to other countries, and therefore also a warning as to what we can do to prepare.
So Father Bob I've known for about 15 years here in Rome. He's an American professor of the prelature of Opus Dei, and he teaches ethics at the works Pontifical University of the Holy Cross, like I mentioned before. And his specialty is moral anthropology and ethics. He also helps run the research center known as Markets, Culture, and Ethics, with whom Acton Institute has a very friendly collaboration. We've done a lot of events together. But before becoming a priest and moral philosopher, Father Bob actually studied chemical engineering and had a short career in Silicon Valley. Father Bob comes with invaluable experience in the world of science and work and technology. And he's here to tell us about his experience as a research fellow at Harvard Institute for Quantitative Social Sciences, where he just spent a sabbatical semester last fall. So Bob, here we go with our first question. I'd like to go back to a conversation we had when we had lunch together at the university in Rome, way back when Romans could still congregate for work, worship, and social life. And you were telling me about your sabbatical experience at Harvard's Institute for Quantitative Social Science. And I was very curious about what you had studied, and you had told me that you were there to further your research in anthropological studies and human flourishing, and with a particular interest in self-mastery, but doing this from a cross-disciplinary perspective of human action theory and psychology. So you told me that you focused on, probably half jokingly, on none other than the very meaning of the word focus. And actually this was the singularly most important term to psychologists today in their contemporary research. So tell us, why is focus so important to positive, enterprising human action?
Indeed, Michael, yes, thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak about the recent research semester that I had at Harvard in the Institute for Quantitative Social Sciences and what's called the Human Flourishing Program. It's a wonderful group there that's directed by Tyler Vanderweel, who has a chair and is professor of public health at Harvard. There's a group there of philosophers and sociologists, psychologists, and people who are really experts in epidemiology, public health, in applying statistics to understanding not just how diseases are spread and how contagion occurs throughout a population, which of course right now is a very hot topic because of coronavirus, but also, and this is a niche that Tyler Vanderweel, the director of Harvard's Human Flourishing Program, has been opening for the Human Flourishing Program. It's a niche that he's really created and he's promoted, and he's opening for other scholars to enter from various disciplines. The niche is a kind of epidemiology. It's a kind of public health. But instead of studying the contagion of disease, this new form of epidemiology studies how well-being can be spread, or if you want, contaged throughout a population, which is really a fascinating topic for someone whose expertise is in the field of ethics and moral philosophy. So you bring up the topic of focus in our conversation over lunch the other day. Focus is such, it's really a fascinating issue. Fascinating topic. There's a book that's been published on focus, which is very connected to another book that's been published by Gahl Newport on deep work. This idea that when we really concentrate on something and set our minds to it, we can also find, and here I can refer to another book, this one by Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, which is called, very simple title again, like the title of the book on focus or deep work. The title is Flow. And this book by Csikszentmihalyi on flow, the idea is by setting our mind, concentrating into deep work, we lose ourselves, which is a kind of finding ourselves, that we find meaning in it because we're focusing on some good that we're seeking in the doing of the task, such that Csikszentmihalyi says the activity itself becomes autotelic, meaning that the end is within the activity itself. You're not doing it for something else, you're doing it for its own sake. And therefore what you are doing is not merely a means, but it's an end in itself. What's really important there is this means that your own humanity becomes, you're acknowledging your humanity as an end in itself, and you're living, respecting your own humanity as an end in itself. And one must be able to focus in order to be able to engage in that kind of activity that is intrinsically satisfying, intrinsically worthwhile. Actually, Karl Wojtyła, who became St. John Paul II, he developed from a philosophical perspective, well before he became Pope, this idea that the human person is structured around this capacity for self-determination. The sense that we determine ourselves who we are through our own activity. So every time we do anything, even every time we experience anything, every time we direct our attention to anything, we are in a sense determining ourselves. Now what's fascinating here, when I said every time we are in a sense determining ourselves, what's fascinating is that today, just over the past 10 years, there's this abundance of research in the area of neuroscience that is indicating that our brains are programmed and patterned according to that to which we attend. And if we develop the habits of focus and attention upon those things that we're really committed to, then we certainly are exercising our freedom, but we're also practicing the ability to focus.
Excellent. I think that's a great answer. And however, can you tell us can you give us a few anecdotal examples of good focus and bad focus? And furthermore, what would be, in essence, good and bad distractions in light of this?
Indeed, a recent article that was published by a neuroscientist, his name is Damien Fair, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, dealing with this issue of freedom and of focus, says that the capacity to maintain task goals and to selectively attend to relevant information and to avoid distraction is unrivaled. Now that's a loaded phrase. And when he says unrivaled, what does he mean by unrivaled? He really seems to mean that it's the most important thing in this created universe, is this capacity to maintain task goals, which is direct oneself according to one's actions, according to one's commitments, and then to attend to relevant information. And by attend to relevant information, it means that our minds are constantly, and our senses are constantly being bombarded by all kinds of distractions. It certainly happens every time our phone buzzes or rings, or we're in social media and we're getting pings, we're getting notifications, someone steps into the room. Now there's times when we need to be distracted and we need to attend to these people because that is part of our commitment and part of our task at hand. But other times when we seek those forms of additional information as a kind of distraction, And therefore, these new technologies and just the high-speed nature of work today, with all the new technologies and the new forms of work today, with using artificial intelligence in many fields and using robotics and computers, are challenging us to not be overloaded by that information, but instead to selectively attend to that which really matters in order to accomplish the task at hand, which means that we then avoid distractions. That capacity, as I said, is, quoting that neuroscientist in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science recent article, is unrivaled. It's the most important thing in the universe, certainly the most important thing for us humans. And we have the ability, we actually have the opportunity to practice this focus in new ways, I think, because of this quarantine, which is a kind of being cloistered, a kind of being locked in a sense, as they say, locked down. Italy is certainly locked down right now, and I know there's areas of the United States that have already been locked down, and it's probably going to be extending, and certainly in waves, in order to flatten the curve, in order to delay some of this contagion, in order to put some relief on hospital workers. And what does that entail? It means that now we have an opportunity to shift our style of work. Perhaps we'll be using even more technology, perhaps we'll have less physical contact with the others, and yet we'll still be constantly bombarded also by the distraction of falling into fear or panic regarding this crisis. But instead, if we're able to attend to that which really matters, to our commitments, to our family, to what we love, to all those good things in our professional work, and this practice of the mind of attending to selectively that which really matters, acting according to our commitment, really means that we're affirming ourselves as an end in ourselves and not as merely means, which will allow us, facilitate us, to be able to treat also those around us, and probably even closer to us, those who are within our quarantine space.
Super, that's great. So anyways, let's bring this conversation to the epicenter of the current public health crisis, which in my opinion is slowly becoming a public mental health crisis. It seems that all we can focus on is COVID-19 fears and their catastrophic consequences. So we focus on what might go wrong, what has gone wrong, what might we lose, who might we lose. We become focused on losing our lives and the lives of others. While all this is true, we find other bad things to focus on, the nightmarish situation of the economy going down the tubes, and in effect us losing our jobs, our pension, and our well-being. We begin to focus on this global reset for the worse, not for the better. So can you tell me, in light of all this, is there any good that can come out of obsessive focus on our fears and horrible consequences? Do they push us to the brink of psychological and spiritual despair? If this is the case, what are your recommendations? What would you tell us to get beyond this?
Right, thank you, Michael. You bring up exactly this point in more detail about how complaining and focusing on the negative, that people find it's really a sick and perverse sort of pleasure in focusing on the negative, when instead they could be contributing to something constructive. And in contributing to the constructive, they'd be growing in virtue, they'd be growing in focus, they'd be growing in commitment. This is especially true for us Christians, where, of course, St. Peter said we should always be ready to explain the reasons that we have for the hope that is within us. And this hope that is within us isn't an optimism simply about material things. It's not like, oh, well, this is just going to go away. But of course, what St. Peter is referring to in his letter is he's referring to our hope in heaven, that we will triumph, even if it means that we have to suffer martyrdom in the meantime. So even death can be passageway to heaven. And of course, we are all going to die. So you're right that in a lot of social media, there is very present a kind of negative critical irony and a complaining spirit. Why is that? I think it's easier to draw attention to oneself by tearing things down, rather than really making a name for oneself by building up. It's easier to tear down. It's more challenging to build up. And when one builds up, people tend to receive that in a quiet way and in a deep way. And they respond in a very positive way, but it tends to be less noisy. There may be less of an echo. Perhaps one gets the followers, but they don't get all of the crazy comments when one makes the positive and constructive.
Thanks, that's very helpful. So my next question is about some of our everyday experiences now on social media. A lot of us are spending much more time on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, the big three. And this is quite normal as we're looking for information, we're looking for friendship, we're looking to reach out to others in need and share helpful information. However, I'm noticing that there's quite a negative trend that everyone is looking for and literally liking, as on Facebook, very bad news. So stories about the dramatic increase of contagion and death get tons of likes. Or the recent 9,000 point drop in the Dow Jones Index is getting lots of likes. Or people, are even liking very sad and very distressing reports about priests dying, first responders dying, churches being closed, which none of us surely like, but those are the posts that we're paying attention to. Anyways, at least telling others through the like button that we've read this and that this is important to us. However, have you ever noticed, especially, for example, when someone posts something positive or some sign of hope about the current crisis, that such posts aren't getting very much attention? Generally, they're being ignored. Well, for example, I posted a couple stories about experiments from virologists with the substance called chloroquine, especially out of Marseille in France. And they're actually finding some positive results. However, these posts are being completely ignored on the internet. So what's the reason for this? Are we so depressed and perhaps focused on the evil outcomes, or at least on the negative outcomes of the current situation, that's all we want to surround ourselves with, the so-called bad news? And if so, do we stop looking for the good news that is found in Jesus Christ and our trust and faith in God to get over this current crisis, get out of this sort of hell on earth?
So Michael, you asked specifically about focusing on our fears and how this panic mode that some people can be find themselves in because of the COVID-19 can lead to a certainly lack of focus and a kind of distraction. This is very much related to recent psychological and neuroscientific work in the area of stress, which is really fascinating because it was demonstrated probably 20 years ago, and the data was accumulating from up until around 10 years ago when the science has shifted on this. But the data was accumulating saying that stress is bad for you, that stress can kill you, that stress is lethal. There is its truth to that, and yet there's now, and this came about around 10 years ago, that there's a really important distinction with respect to stress. And it's a distinction between how one subjectively appraises something that happens to oneself and that objective stressor. So just to put that distinction more simply, it's a distinction between the objective quality of the stressor, like the event that happens that affects us, like the coronavirus, and then how we appraise that, how we handle it interiorly, what kind of attention we give to it, what sort of attention, the quality of our attention and the quantity of our attention. And here what's found is that if one reframes the stress, or I should say the stressor, if one reframes this objective stressor in such a way that one perceives it as a challenge and as an opportunity for growth, that then it actually becomes something very positive and for one's health positive. Even more so if one does within a community. For instance, if one thinks, this is also stressful for other people, my family, for my colleagues, my coworkers. So what can I do to help them? That this has to do with the neurotransmitter hormone that's called oxytocin, that some people call the cuddle hormone. It has some tremendous, really positive effects that we secrete it, and it bathes the brain cells within us, and it also has an impact even on our heart tissue that is protective of our heart from the distress that could result from the objective stressor. So instead, when one turns to others with a kind of social relationship in the face of that objective stressor, by seizing it as a challenge, as an opportunity, either to help others or to be helped by them, or both, it becomes an opportunity, not just for growth in one's virtue, but actually an opportunity for healing, for medical healing, and for this hormonal and neuro pattern to be engraved within us, such that the next time we tend to react to a problem by thinking, oh, here's an opportunity, here's a chance that I have to help the others, here's a chance that I have to reach out to someone else for help. It's a really important lesson, and it's been proven by the medical neuroscientific data that what really matters in stress is not how big the objective external stressor is on us, but how we appraise it. And insofar as we seize upon it as a challenge, as an opportunity for growth, here's an opportunity for me to struggle and to grow, that I'll be better after this situation. There's all kinds of data on this. One of the psychologists who's published on this in a very persuasive way is Kelly McGonigal at Stanford University, who has a superb TED Talk on this issue that's entitled "Make Stress Your Friend." And she also has a book about this, how stress can be embraced in a positive way and as a challenge. So in this time of the COVID-19, it's certainly an opportunity for us to practice this way of living the stress that we are experiencing now in a special way, by appraising it as an opportunity, as a challenge, so that we can grow rather than suffer some negative consequences of just being all wrapped up inside one's own head and thinking, oh, this is terrible, this is bad. For instance, if you complain, and this is, here again, it's amazing how the scientific data just totally lines up and complements the spiritual tradition, including medieval authors. You can go even farther back to monks in the desert, back in certainly the 6th century, I think also the 5th and 4th century after Christ, that they all say the same thing. There's this wonderful writer who says, in a very pithy way, a spiritual writer, even a little bit of complaining is incompatible with even a little bit of patience.
I want to come to kind of a concluding and inspiring point. In recent research, I have studied a lot about Sid Fulton Sheen and Saint John Henry Newman, who was just canonized. And what the two holy men have in common is that they were brilliant visionary teachers and creative thinkers. Now, they both say that their so-called secret to success and intelligence and creativity was that they always started their day, or at least never missed a day, focusing on the Blessed Sacrament through a dedicated holy hour in the church. Something which is becoming much more difficult, even discouraged here in Rome. Whilst on their knees and in total focus and total contemplation on Jesus and the Blessed Sacrament, they said that they found that they were more receptive through petitionary prayer and through focus on God's almighty power and intelligence, that they became more receptive to God's will and intelligence. And what were the results of this? Well, they found themselves coming up with some of their greatest ideas, some of their clearest ideas, and some of the best solutions to their then present day problems. So would you recommend that all of us, when we can and be back in the churches, focus more of our attention on the real presence through greater devotion in the Blessed Sacrament in order to come up with more genial solutions to everyday problems? And if so, couldn't even scientists today spend a few minutes in front of the Blessed Sacrament or more in contemplation of the divine in order to find better solutions to the current pandemic?
Right. Thank you, Michael, for bringing up Venerable Fulton Sheen and Saint John Henry Newman as examples of how they privileged meditation contemplation before the Blessed Sacrament at the beginning of their day, and how this led to the their brilliant work, their genius work, which also had such an impact, a huge impact on so many people during their lives and brought about so many conversions to the faith in Jesus Christ. Now, this is again a topic which is so closely related to recent discoveries in neuroscience. So, and it's connected to, this came up in our discussion over lunch, the topic of willpower. There's a neuroscientist in Canada at the University of Toronto, his name is Michael Inslicht, who's been part of this front of scientists who have been shifting how we understand willpower. It used to be thought that willpower was this homogeneous reserve that would just sort of run out, and then we'd have to take a break or we'd give in to a temptation. But there's a lot of new data on this, which indicates that it's much more complicated, that our willpower, our ability to resist temptation and to continue to persevere in striving for the goods that we're seeking, really to pay attention to that which really counts, is not a homogeneous resource. It's heterogeneous, and it depends on what's called shifting commitments. It depends on our values at every moment. So it depends upon what we are committed to. And here again, it's beautiful how this relates to the classical philosophical tradition, for instance, of Aristotle. And for Aristotle, virtue depends upon our acting according to reason. And our reason, our intellect, informing our habits, informing our passions, informing our activity, such that what we do is reasonable and in accord with our plan of reason. Now, this all is interwoven because Michael Inslicht, that neuroscientist at the University of Toronto, has shown that where it looks like one's willpower has been depleted because one is exhausted and one's been resisting, they do these tests where they have someone have to go through something very boring and answer questions one after another, and they put a cookie next to them. And they tell them, if you have to keep answering these questions, you can't have the cookie. And it seems that people end up making more mistakes and giving up on the questions. If there's a cookie sitting next there, it's a distraction. And it seems to deplete their willpower. But what Inslicht has shown is that if those same subjects during a test like that turn their minds towards some intrinsic value that really matters for them, he says that their willpower is immediately replenished. It's just filled up once again to the brim. It's as though your gas tank has run out and now you've got a full gas tank. Why? Because you've contemplated with your mind that which really counts. And this has been shown to be exactly that which occurs when we practice meditation. So that there are neuroscientists and psychologists today, for instance, there's one at Oxford University whose name is Mark Williams, and he explicitly proposes, and he has YouTube videos about how one can practice what he calls secular meditation. Because they recognize that meditation is good for us. It's good for us as humans. It helps us to flourish. It helps us to act according to our commitments. It helps us to focus. And so why not, if you're not a believer, why not also meditate? And that's what this secular meditation is. Well, fine. But it's also true that if you're a Christian and you believe in Jesus Christ, your Savior, and you believe in the Blessed Trinity, that by turning our minds to things of heaven, to the supreme good, and spending time contemplating and then being aware that we get distracted and then turning away from those distractions and turning back to the one who is the supreme good, that very practice of meditation reprograms our brains so that in the midst of any difficulty throughout our practical life, for instance, as you mentioned, Michael, a scientist who's working on the next cure for coronavirus or on the vaccine in order to prevent transmission of coronavirus, certainly they're going to get tired and get distracted. Well, if that very scientist has been practicing meditation, and hopefully the deepest form of meditation, which is ecstatic and transcendent towards God himself, who is the supreme good, that he's practiced that in the morning, for instance, at the beginning of the day, perhaps directed towards the Blessed Sacrament, perhaps on his knees, that then he will be more fortified, empowered, capacitated, so that he will be capable of this following through in that hard work that is required, maybe crunching the numbers, looking at the data, coming up also with the genius new idea, and then figuring out a way of testing it, putting it into practice. He'll be more capable of performing all of those functions, which is exactly focus, being able to pay attention to that which really matters, to one's commitment, being able to set aside everything else that's a distraction to focus on what really counts, because one has been practicing meditation. And hopefully we can even practice that meditation always. As St. Paul says, that we should pray always. We should give thanks always. Always be aware that we are children of God, sons and daughters of God, that we're in his presence, that he is gazing upon us, and that we are working for him. And then that work can be holy. It can be sanctified.
Great, excellent. Well, Father Bob, thank you again for all your answers and time. We've been very much enlightened. I ask that you pray for us, all of us that are at home, determined and positive, focused on what they can do and what God wants of us during this situation. We all hope that we can, through God's inspiration and will, eventually find enterprising solutions to the current crisis. No doubt we'll find a way with his will.
Thank you, Michael. It's been wonderful being with you today with this conversation. May God bless you, and may God bless everyone who's been listening to us on this podcast.
Great, thank you again. Well, everybody, until next month, and hopefully we'll have some good news about solutions that have been found to the current crisis. In the meantime, stay safe, and rest assured we will all get through this all together in a very short amount of time. Thank you again. Goodbye, everybody.